Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Marissa Harrison. She is an associate professor of psychology in the School of Behavioral Sciences and Education and interim chair of social sciences and psychology at Penn State Harrisburg. She is a research psychologist who investigates serial murder and interest in serial murder from an evolutionary and other psychological perspectives. And today we're going to talk about her book, Just as Deadly: The Psychology of Female Serial Killers. So, Marissa, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure is mine, Ricardo. Thank you for inviting me.
So, when we talk about serial killers, we usually focus on men, and we will get into why in a second, perhaps because some of the most prominent cases are males, but we'll get into the reasons behind it. Anyway, when it comes to the percentages of men and women that are serial killers, what do we know about it?
Sure. Well, absolutely. First, let me say again, thank you for having me. I know so many great things about you, so the pleasure is mine. Okay, so you asked what percentage female serial killers are of serial killers in general. Let me give the caveat that we probably don't know every serial killer that's out there, right? So
Yeah.
the general estimate is that 1 out of 6 serial murderers are female. It's
One out of six. Yeah.
1 out of 6, yes.
But in terms of the percentage of the general population, do we know? At least the estimates we have, what percentage of men and women commit this type of crime?
Okay, so I don't know if I have a general percentage. However,
Okay.
it, you have better odds of getting struck by lightning or hit by a bus, literally, because somebody's actually figured out those odds, than being killed by a serial killer. So astronomical odds against becoming a serial killer or getting killed by one.
Okay, that's good to know, I guess.
Yes, it is. It's very, very scary phenomenon. Yes.
Are there any issues with how people, the police, the criminal justice system classify serial killers or killings or whatever kind of technical term they use? Might there be any issue there? Can they be undercounted or something like that for whatever kind of reason?
Sure, that's a great question. So, there's been a lot of research conducted on understanding and classifying male serial killers. So I believe the experts have a good grasp on that. However, female serial killers don't fit neatly into the framework. Well, I've found in my research, and my colleagues that I've worked with have also found, they don't really fit so neatly into those male-specific categories that have been established. Also, if you think about it, male serial killers very frequently are sexual serial killers, so killings based on sexual motivation, and female serial killers just generally don't do that. So to create a framework where it's all about male motive, meaning, etc., it just doesn't quite work for the women. That's what I've found in my research.
And we'll come back to the motivations a bit
Sure.
later. But okay, so getting into my initial question again, why is it the case that female serial killers have sort of been neglected in the literature, and people almost always talk only about the male ones?
That's a very, very good question, and I don't know if we have the best answer for that, but there's a few things that I've come up with my own research and reading the research of others. So first of all, people don't expect women to do this kind of thing, right? So there is the gender stereotype of female as a gentle, nurturing caregiver. I'm not saying that's true. It just seems to be that's general stereotype. And killing someone, murdering someone, poisoning a baby, strangling an older person, um, giving poison to an older person just doesn't really fit in that motif of female as caregiver. So there's that. And in fact, it was the case that the FBI, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, they initially had come out with the statement that there are no female serial killers and that all serial killing was sexual. So we know women don't typically do that. So there was a notion for a long time that women just aren't serial killers, and that's just not true.
And before we get into demographic data and other sorts of factors that play a role in female serial killing, let me just ask you this, because you not only study female serial killing, but also interest in that. I mean, why people are interested in serial killing in general.
Sure.
So, I mean, why are some people interested in that, and the ones that are interested, is that a problem, or might that be a problem? I mean, could it be that people who are interested in serial killing over time get, at least to some extent, desensitized to the nature of this type of crime, or not?
I do think people are interested in serial murder because it taps into what we call morbid curiosity. Morbid curiosity, right? And I do think morbid curiosity is a byproduct of protective vigilance. What does that mean? All right. We have evolved, of course, over millions of years of human evolution to pay attention to the things that could harm us, right? Something is bad, we, pay direct attention to it. People look at car accidents when they drive by. Something's horrible on a news broadcast. You run over to see it. And whether or not people know it, I firmly believe unconsciously people have a pre-programmed inclination to pay attention to the things that can harm us, right? So again, they might not be thinking, hey, I'm going to watch this show to maximize my chance of survival. That's not the case. The proximate mechanism is, wow, let me pay attention. I think it's interesting. But ultimately, deep down, unconsciously, I do think it taps into a survival mechanism. That's what I think. So interest in serial killers, morbid curiosity, protective vigilance. And we do have some data to show that those concepts are related. Erica Frederick and I, she's a psychologist as well, we did a study on it and we found as such.
And I mean, just to be clear, I asked you about why people would be interested, or at least some people interested in this sort of thing. And I mean, this, of course, is being interested in it is very, very, very different from being interested in committing the crime, right? I mean, because there are people, because that would get us into the territory of some silly literature that's been discredited over and over relating to, for example, people who play violent video games or watch violent movies, violent TV series, whatever, or read violent books. Even, I mean, the sort of correlation that people have sort of forcefully tried to establish between consuming that kind of thing or that kind of entertainment and being more prone to violence or to crime, right? And that's not at all the case.
Well, if that's what you say, I hear you. I don't study that type of thing, so I can't speak for and against it. I will just add, as a researcher, correlation does not equal causation, right? So even if there was, I'm not saying there is or isn't, I haven't read those papers, so I can't speak to that. But correlation does not equal causation. Just because one variable is related to another doesn't mean it's causal. It could be the case that people who are inclined to be violent might seek A and seek B. So we can't say that. But just to speak to what you were saying, I would not say and could not say that people attend crime conventions and listen to murder podcasts and whatnot to learn tips, right? I really don't think that's true. I mean, we don't know everybody. We don't know the operation of people's minds. There might be one or two people out there who are engaging in careful planning. Let's hope not. But by and large, I think people are just interested. And I think it's an evolved interest. Now, that being said, Ricardo, I do want to mention, I mean, there are people who take it to an extreme, to a surprising extreme. I mean, I am appreciative when people are engaged in consuming scientific information. I really am. But I got to admit, I don't understand when people purchase, gruesome memorabilia for murder, crime scene photos, explaining the victim. That's just not something I would be into personally. I can't understand it. It's a bit disturbing to me.
Yeah, right. So, but let's get into then some more of the psychology of female serial killers. So, what do we know when it comes to their demographic data?
So, we know that what the data show is that they're typically white, they're typically at least middle class. A good portion, maybe up to almost 40%, are nurses or caretakers, work in some kind of caregiving field. The data were sparse, but in every case where I could find the perpetrator's religion, they were Christian. Again, correlation doesn't equal causation. We're just talking demographics here. Very likely to have been married at the time of the crime, probably were married more than once, and in terms of demographics, probably committed their crimes, at least one of them in the suburban area, right? So you have people who commit crimes in rural, urban, and suburban, probably hit the suburbs somewhere. That's what our data show. Oh, and let me just add, usually at least completed a high school education. So smart, there's of average intelligence too, right? So smart people.
Right.
Got it.
And yeah, and before we get into more of the biological factors and evolutionary psychology of this, are there specific aspects in their development, life events, or experiences that tend to be common across female serial killers or not?
I'm I'm actually glad you asked that, because that's one of the key things that I took away when writing Just as Deadly. I have found, and I know people have tried to dispute this along the path of female serial killer research, but I've found a lot of female serial killers, actually, and male serial killers, were abused when they were younger, physically and sexually. I don't have a percentage for you. I'm working on a project right now where I could try to document that. It's going to be difficult. But when I dove into the case studies, I wrote about, I think there's about 27 different case studies in my book. Most of them are female serial killers, but I did write a couple on males just for comparison's sake. It's just struck me how many were sexually abused when they were younger. So there's that, right? So we would say they have a traumagenic background, or tend to, but please let me add, because I am a research psychologist, almost everybody who's ever lived that had something like that terrible happen to them, right, did not go on to be a serial murderer. So please don't think I'm attributing. It's just, it seems like perhaps that changed who they were and led them down a dark path.
But I mean, even though the vast majority of people who have those kinds of horrid experiences do not go on
Right.
to commit crime, it's still, I guess, an important source of information, because possibly if that kind of abuse could be prevented,
Right.
then down the line, we would have fewer serial killers.
I
Right.
so I don't I don't want to make the bold leap and
Mm.
say yes, but it makes sense, right? So if this is very common in their lives, if people get the mental health help that they need if something bad happens, well, can't we at least argue it decreases the likelihood, right?
Mhm.
So you and I can't sit here and say, yeah, stop that and you'll stop this, right? But what we
Yeah.
could say is, I think it would probably have made a difference in some of these perpetrators' lives. Absolutely. And then you asked other experiences. So let me add that I did see a profound history of mental illness in female serial killers, actually, and male serial killers.
Mhm.
And let me just say this: the estimates that I give and that are in my book are very likely underestimates, because, I mean, there weren't always perfect, there's still not perfect diagnostic systems in place in the United States. The perpetrators in my book they were all in the United States.
Mhm.
So what we found was about 40% of female serial killers, and it was close to, I believe, 90%, 90% of male serial killers had some form of mental illness. And again, Ricardo, let's just make sure we say that almost everybody who's mentally ill will not commit violence, let alone become a serial killer. In fact, research shows over and over again that people who are mentally ill are far more likely to be victimized themselves, right?
Yeah.
So we do say that. However, we see this in common, right? And we go back to, well, maybe if they got some of the diagnoses and help. And let me mention the case of Eileen Wuornos. She was an infamous serial killer in the United States, and she clearly was showing signs of concern. Her high school or junior high called her caregiver, which was her grandmother, and said, can we give Eileen mental health help?
Mm-hmm.
And the grandmother said no. So what if Eileen got that help back then? Would 7 men still be alive? I mean, we can't say that for sure, but it would have at least increased the chance Eileen would have, exhibited some wellness later on.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what are the aspects of how female serial killers in this case go about committing their crimes that might point to an evolutionary psychological explanation to their behavior?
Interesting. Okay, so I am an evolutionary psychologist, so it's an interesting story how I got down this path of studying serial murder. I mean, you could study anything from an I know that you're a proponent of evolutionary analysis. You could just study just about anything from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
I set about on a team. Actually, it was a student's idea. She said, let's study female serial killers. I said, okay, and then took it from there. But from our data, I realized that women more frequently commit crimes against people they know. Well, female serial killers, let me say that. Female serial killers most commonly commit murder against people that they know, and the most common motive is for profit, right? So we get something out of it, we get money, we get insurance benefits, that kind of thing. And then looking at others' research, male serial killers kill strangers and kill largely for sex. And like, wow, that really does sound evolutionary. And you gotta go way back to the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And if you think about, and again, this is going way back, think about how in ancestral times we lived as hunter-gatherers. Well, that's what anthropological evidence shows. So men were hunters, females were gatherers by and large. And so what do people who kill strangers do? They hunt, they stalk, they keep trophies sometimes, right? And that's what male serial killers do. Females in the ancestral environment probably gathered things around them. And so here we have female serial killers gathering profits and, figuratively speaking, gathering victims, killing the people who are around them. So I call that the hunter-gatherer hypothesis of serial murder. And it seems to work. I mean, it doesn't explain every single aspect of it, but it provides an interesting framework. And then, of course, men kill for sex, women kill for money. That fits evolutionary motives to a T. So I do believe there's an evolved component, at least part of it.
Mm-hmm. So when it...
Sorry, Ricardo, again, I do give the caveat right here that I'm not saying people evolved to be serial killers because we would all be dead, right? So, but it just might speak to some tendencies that play into the proclivity for serial murder.
Sure. So when it comes to the motivations, in the case of females, it's money, primarily.
Right. Yeah. Profit is the number one motive. I mean, there are other motives, right? There's power, and there might be revenge or angel of death type things, but it's the very common motive is for profit.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the victims they prefer to target, are there sex differences there?
So what I found was that female serial killers tend to kill both men and women, right? So if we break them down into kill women only, kill men only, kill men and women, they tend to kill men and women, versus male serial killers tend to kill women. That's what the data show. Now, if you look at the pool of victims, and sometimes it's really hard to do because the victims aren't easily identifiable, we don't know. It seems like numerically, female serial killers might kill more men, more males. But what type of killer they are, most commonly, they're equal opportunity killers. They kill both men and women.
And are there, I mean, this is an extremely delicate question, but are there any aspects in their, let's say, modus operandi, I mean, the way they commit their crimes that in which men and women differ?
Sure. So in other words, and it is right, the sensitive question, like how they kill. So
Yeah.
women typically poison, female serial killers typically poison. Men, I believe it's that one. I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's strangulation, right? So, but men and women are different. I can look it up if you want. Okay, you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So I do have to revise what I said about killing, right? So who do they target, right? So women typically killed adults only, and male serial killers typically killed adults only. Female serial killers most frequently killed males and females, uncommonly killed females only, and male serial killers most frequently killed females, uncommonly killed males only. And then you had asked about the typical means by which they murder. And so for female serial killers, the most common method was poison. It was nearly half of them. And for male serial killers, the most common method was asphyxiation, just about half of them. And about 1 in 5 male serial killers shot their victims. And it's very rare for a female serial killer to do that. We had Eileen Wuornos, and I can't necessarily think of another lone acting female serial killer that did that. That's just the data that we have. Of course, Ricardo, we might have missed some cases and whatnot, but we tried our best to gather what was out there.
But at least from the cases we know of, there seems to be more physical violence when it's men committing these type of crimes, right?
You're exactly right. But we can think of also overt violence, right? So like physically harming somebody. But I want to argue that if somebody gives somebody else arsenic, just the internal violence that goes on, I mean, the person literally, their organs rot and bleed, and they get encephalitis, and they get violent gastric issues, and it's just a really horrible death when somebody is poisoned. So it's indirectly violent, right? They're giving them an agent that makes this happen to them versus a male serial killer. If you strangle somebody with an object or with your hands, that's that's another level of gruesome and violent.
Yes, I mean, I was just trying to emphasize that point because that might also point to a sex difference there, right? Because on average, men tend to be a little bit more aggressive and physically violent than women.
You're exactly right. I mean, in terms of strangling and even the sexual assault, and so some people say like smothering with a pillow is like indirect aggression. I don't know if I agree with that. So, I hear you. You're right. Male serial killers do tend to be more overtly violent, but just with an understanding of what happens to someone when they're poisoned, right? I think that's one of the reasons I call the book Just as Deadly. Like that's just a horrible cascade of events when somebody's poisoned. So it's gruesome, just maybe in a different category, right?
Earlier, we talked a little bit about the motivations and why male and female serial killers do what they do, and we mentioned money and sex. So when it comes to female serial killers wanting money, I mean, what do they want the money for? Because is it for themselves, or could it be also for other people they are related to?
Really good question. So I didn't gather data on that. I see really no evidence, if I'm thinking back to the cases where they collected money to be a benefactor to others, right? I just never saw that. My guess would be they want it for themselves. And then we have the type of female serial killer who kills their own kids. So it's not like they were killing to provide for their offspring, right? It just seems like maybe they were gathering it for themselves. So we can tie that back to, if women have an evolved tendency to gather or to collect resources, that would be over time, evolutionary speaking, to provide for themselves and their offspring, etc. But in this case, it's gone a little or a lot wayward, right? So you're collecting resources, but just for yourself and harming everybody around you.
Mhm. Yeah, I just asked because it could be the case that some of them would be doing it to get money to provide for, I know, their kids or
Right.
something like that. Since they're females.
Right. You would think, yes, you're absolutely right. I didn't see that so much. I really didn't. I saw them keeping it for themselves, but I didn't gather hardcore data on that. But yeah, I think the mechanism has gone so wayward that it's just self-indulgence.
Mhm. What about neurological data? Because when it comes to crime, and of course that kind of data is also usually very limited, but sometimes people collect neurological data on criminals. So, do we know anything about that? Is there something about female serial killers' brains that functions differently from the brains of common people, of other
Right.
people?
That's a really, really, really good question. And so the answer is exactly what you said. There's just no data out there on that. And I've gotten pushback on this from when I've spoken to crowds and whatnot. I mean, I can only tell you what's out there, and it's not really out there. I have seen very, very limited evidence of neurological studies of female serial killers. I saw one conducted um, by a team, might have been in Mexico, and a woman who had perpetrated serial murder showed really a differential neural response to stimuli that should invoke fear. Other than that, I mean, if people think there's documented frontal lobe differences or different limbic structural responses, that's just not out there to my knowledge. I just I've been a researcher for a long time. I think I know where to look at PubMed and all the psychology databases and neurology databases. I just don't see that out there. Now, are there data on violence and crime in general? Sure, but even that is not 100% conclusive, as you probably know. Most definitely, people who can't control their temper and their impulses probably have some kind of executive function issue, probably have some kind of frontal lobe issue. So the frontal lobe's not connecting with the emotional structures. You're not able to control those impulses. But don't we argue that serial murder isn't always impulsive, right? That's impulsive violence. Somebody is carefully planning these things. And so I've not seen, now again, I've not studied any serial killer with an MRI myself, but even like there's a prominent neurocriminologist, his name is Adrian Rangan, and he even emphasizes absolutely not, there's no way to put somebody's brain in a scanner and say you're a serial murderer, or he even, the language he uses, we can't even predict that, you're a one-off from it, like you're going to do it. So the evidence is very, very unconvincing. There's just not that many studies out there on studying brains. In fact, there's more information that families of male serial killers wouldn't allow their brains to be studied. Like, I believe that was it the family of Jeffrey Dahmer, they wouldn't allow his brain to be studied. John Wayne Gacy, his sisters, after he died, after he was executed, his sisters said his brain could be studied, but reports say that they took his brain after autopsy and put it in a jar and drove it home in a car. So you're not going to be able to study that with any kind of scientific certainty. But female serial killers, in terms of neural differences between female serial killers and male serial killers, or neural differences between serial murderers in general and the general population, I'm not saying there's not. I don't see evidence of it. It's typically tied to, well, here's what violent criminals might have in terms of a neural profile. And you do see, for example, frontal lobe issues in people who are, like studies of inmates on death row who have volunteered for this type of thing to be studied. Maybe some neural differences there, but that's a leap, right? Because serial killers aren't always impulsive. It's female serial killers plan their crimes. So that's what I've seen anyway.
Yeah. Uh, have you looked into personality traits or anything like that? So, just one thing that came to mind now. Have you looked into, for example, the dark triad? Could it be that female serial killers score higher on these three traits?
So, okay, you tested my clinical, you're testing my clinical trivia here. So dark triad is narcissism,
Machiavellianism and psychopathy.
psychopathy, right? Okay. So some recent research, I know the dark triad's been a prevailing theory for a long time. There's some recent research that shows just one of them is predictive of violence and crime, which negates the triad type thing. Now, for female serial killers, I think you're going to see a lot of evidence of psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of narcissism or Machiavellianism, I mean, without somebody here for a clinical psychologist, and I'm not one, but a clinical psychologist to sit and interview, I think that's a stretch. I think there are some good books and papers out there on dark triad as related to male perpetrated serial murder. I do think you see the Machiavellianism and certainly psychopathy. I don't know about necessarily narcissism. I don't study male serial killers the way I study female serial killers. But in terms of personality, like openness to experience, conscientiousness, neuroticism, I just have never studied that.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it just came to mind, so it could be that you knew, something about that. And the dark triad, particularly, many times is brought to the table when it comes to understanding this kind of deviant, let's say, behavior. So.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Like I said, though, just there's some evidence to refute the necessity of the triad of it. But I will leave that to the clinical psychologist to solve that mystery.
Yeah, maybe I can invite someone on the show who's done work on that.
Oh, absolutely. It would be really, really, really interesting. I would have. I always have to give the caveat that I'm not a clinical psychologist because we just, I'm not a clinician. I'm not able to make diagnoses. And even if you make a diagnosis, you have to sit and interview the person and whatnot. So it's kind of hard when there's not a lot of access to serial murderers out there.
Yeah, there's the other thing, right? That's the other thing, because many times you see people, for example, on television commenting on certain serial killer cases, and they do not really know the person. They haven't sit down with her to talk to her and study her and know a little bit more about her background and stuff like that. So many times people on television and other media are only speculating.
Oh, you are absolutely right. In fact, that violates the Goldwater rule, right? You have to interview somebody and come up with assessments. But you bring up a good point. And so, I mean, I am a college professor. I'm a research psychologist. I have a degree in research. Whatever I write, I have resources for. My book has about 1,200 references in it. It's not a true crime, babble where I think I know these things and try to appeal to, like requisite gore interest. It's not that at all. I mean, my book, I do believe, has some disturbing material in it, but it's factual. I got my data from newspapers and court reports and whatnot, wherever I could go to original documents. But yeah, it is disturbing the number of people who claim to be experts on anything that they're not an expert on. I mean, if somebody wants to call me an expert because I have papers and books on serial murder, okay, I mean, call me what you want. But at least I know I personally gathered the data that I'm talking about. There are people who just, armchair quarterback talking about just somebody who has, a microphone and a platform. And it's just, I pause with the information that's out there these days. In fact, there's been a couple cases in the media where people were exposed. They said they were serial killer experts and they were not. And I just wonder what the mechanism is behind the need for attention there. I don't know.
Which is very unfortunate, because in this particular case, when it comes to this type of crime and other crimes, of course, many times those TV commentators and commentators elsewhere might be contributing to lots of misinformation and stereotypes and misperceptions and misconceptions people have about crime and criminals.
It is interesting you should say that. I attended a public event with somebody who is known for being on TV and speaking to crime and criminals and whatnot. We don't have to mention who that was. And the question was posed, could paying attention to crime and criminals be addicting? All right, so it is possible that when exposed to this type of stimuli, dopamine is raised in your brain. It increases dopamine in the brain, the neurotransmitter that plays a role in addiction. Okay, so my answer was via that mechanism, yes, we can argue that it could have addictive properties. And this person's response was, no, it can't. Okay, well, you must be right because you're on TV. I mean, what do you want? I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I'm explaining, my degree is in biopsychology. Okay, I'm not saying I'm all that in a bag of chips, but that's just factual based on neurology and the mechanisms of neurotransmitters. But their answer was, no, it's not. So, look, I work with people in the field that I know have collected their own data. People like Claire Alley and Enzo Yaksik and Frederick Totes. I mean, I just know that they're experts in what they do. So it does scare me, the misinformation that could be out there. In fact, I've read blogs and such online that have taken from my own papers and repeated facts and, not given credit to the author. I mean, that's just, I don't need you to say, oh, Marissa, that's really cool. I just need you to engage in good science and attribute where you got those findings from. And the people get clicks and they get paid for plagiarizing my research. It's like, come on, I'd be happy to share the paper with you. Science is about sharing, but it just scares me, the lack of professionalism that's out there. I guess it makes money for some people.
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, so another question then. So we talked about development and background stuff and biological factors and all of that, neurological as well. So do we know anything about sociocultural factors? I mean, could there be anything in a particular society or in a particular cultural context that contributes to, in this case, female serial killing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think we would be remiss to think it didn't play a role. So I give the caveat, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a cultural psychologist, but think about, the role of gender in a given time or women's role in history. Absolutely. And so I would argue that each of the things we talked about must play a role in serial murder, right? Because we don't develop in a vacuum. So we have evolutionary influences and we have proximate biological mechanisms like frontal lobe, executive function, right? We have hormones and genetics and epigenetics, right? And then we have the social world, right? We have our parents and our siblings and our friends and our media and our institutions, our governments and our religious organizations, right? In our time in history, absolutely. And then we have the psychology, right? We have how you think, your cognitive mechanisms. So each of those things must play a role basically in anything we do, but in terms of creating the proclivity for serial murder, absolutely each of those factors must play a role. I wrote a case study on I gathered information on to create a case study for a male serial killer named Ronald Dominique, and a prominent sociologist, and I cite him in my book Just as Deadly. He looked at the sociocultural factors of the case. He's a mitigation expert, and he talked about how poverty probably played a role in this person's background, and people made fun of him. He was gay and made fun of, and he probably internalized that. So and his mother and her own brother had just a questionable relationship, and that probably played a role in Ronald Dominique's background. So yeah, absolutely, each of those things. And then I stress that I say each of those things plays a role in the proclivity or the possibility you may become a serial murderer. Because think about it, you can have all of those traumatic factors in place, all those social pressures, all those biological factors, but it doesn't mean you're going to do it. And it also doesn't mean you have the means and the opportunity to do it. So becoming a serial killer is this perfect storm of factors, and it is rare, but it is very dangerous when it happens, of course.
I was also just thinking that could it be the case that in modern industrialized and post-industrial societies, because most people are virtually anonymous and we can move places more easily, that it would be easier for someone to be a serial killer in this kind of context than, for example, in a small-scale hunter-gatherer society where everyone is monitored by everyone and virtually all the time, and everyone knows everyone who lives there.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting thought. Think about this too. Maybe that created a better window before today, right? So long after hunter-gatherer times, but before today's, technology world where you can't walk down a street corner without 20 cameras pointing on you. So maybe so like the late 1800s, the 1900s, maybe even the early 2000s. Maybe
Yeah, because you have the cameras, but more
right,
recently, a few decades ago in
right,
the 70s, 80s, you didn't have any of that, right?
exactly. So maybe the
Yeah.
window was, do we say better? No, the window was more open back then, but now, right? So just like the days of hunter-gatherer, where everybody knows everybody. I mean, now we have increasingly sophisticated detection techniques, right? In terms of how and when a murder was committed. Um,
And you
we
also have DNA testing, for
have
example.
exactly DNA testing and cameras everywhere, and nobody carries cash anymore. Everything is electronic transactions, and how to get on a plane somewhere or a train or your car license plate. I just think that you have a very, very good chance of getting caught, and you probably will get caught before creating that. You probably would get okay. Start that again. You probably would get caught before perpetrating that third murder that would qualify you as a serial killer, right? So I would think so. I think that we're probably going to see fewer serial killers these days, thankfully, because of everything that's involved in being tracked and being caught. So even if somebody has all those terrible things and it happen and chooses to do these terrible things, I think they're probably going to get caught. But
Yeah, I also mentioned that because that could at least partly explain why many of the most prominent serial killer cases we have are from last century, and particularly the 70s, 80s, and
you're
right.
exactly right. And I think now that we know more about the phenomenon of serial killer as a whole, right? So male and female serial killers. If, for example, there's a cluster of missing young people somewhere or a string of murders, I think we now have that previous unfortunate information through which we can understand maybe what's going on today. Just without the connectivity of the internet and databases and whatnot, surely in the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, etc. In fact, I believe that's what happened with John Wayne Gacy, right? So he got out of prison and then moved to a different state, and there was no interstate tracking, even though psychiatrists had warned about the kind of person he was or what he could become. He just wasn't tracked, and really kind of went under the radar. In fact, he was prominent in his area. In I think it was a suburb of Chicago. He was a prominent business person. So not only was he not tracked, he just wasn't suspected. So yeah, interesting, right? So I'm here to talk about female serial killers, but sometimes we have a lot more information on male serial killers.
Yeah, but do we know if the trend has gone in that direction? If over time and with all the different kinds of monitoring we have nowadays and DNA testing and all of that, and people using credit cards instead of money and all of the
Right.
other things you mentioned, that over time the rate of serial killing has gone down or not?
So I think the numbers show that it hasn't decreased, but I'm hesitant to put that forward as a thought that, hey, this is still going on. I just think that what you just said is true. It's just the ability to detect, right? So it's very hard to speak to that, right? So it might have been in the case in the past where there were far more serial murderers. We just didn't put two and two together, two and two and two, right? We didn't put that together, but now we just have the mechanisms for detection. So I don't know. We don't know. And we know, though, there must be the type of serial murderer out there, either male or female, that just doesn't get caught, right? So it's just hard to estimate that. But I will say this, if I may. One point I exited writing my book with is that I do believe we need a lot more resources for police and detectives and agencies. I do have some friends who are detectives and tell me it's just not like what you see on TV. A crime doesn't happen, right? And we run it down to the lab and we have the, our person. They just don't have the money or the time for things like that. It's not like we see
But
CSI.
I mean, on the other hand, what we see on TV is, I mean, absolutely exaggerated because I mean, it's not only the rate of crime that is exaggerated, but also, I mean, it would be impossible for people to spend so many resources on one single crime as we see on TV series and all of that. I mean, that would be utterly unrealistic. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have more money and more resources, but what we see on TV series and movies is just unrealistic, right?
I believe you are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And then if you think about it, uh, serial murder is rare. So do we want to spend the money on that? Look, it's terrible. It should be prevented. God knows that. In the United States, there is a terrible problem with backlogs of rape kits, right? So people who are sexually assaulted and they process the evidence, and those just don't get tested for years and years and years. I mean, where's the priority? I'm not saying murdering isn't a priority, but we just don't have the money for any of this. And you're absolutely right. What we see on TV is made for such, right? It's made to, highlight and showcase that which is out there, but it's not a realistic representation. And so our police and our detectives just don't have access to that type of thing. It's sad. It really is. I wish there was more investment. And then on the front end, right, if we invested more in mental health care, getting people help who need it, right? So maybe we could prevent this stuff in the first place. So
Yeah. So just to wrap the interview up, let's perhaps recap a little bit what's the evolutionary rationale behind serial killing and more specifically female serial killing. So from an evolutionary perspective, what do you think would be the best way of understanding where it comes from, of course, with the
sure.
caveat that we have to add all the other
Right.
variables,
Sure.
psychological, sociological, cultural,
Right. Right, Ricardo.
background, and all
Yeah.
of that.
Right, Ricardo. I don't want people to think I wrote a book that says we evolved to be serial killers because that's just
Yeah.
not it's just not true. But I do believe there's an evolutionary contribution, right? So you got to go way back to the theory of the fundamental differences in human reproduction. So women are born with really just a couple hundred eggs, a couple hundred ova you'll ever use, compared to men who have millions of sperm on a daily basis, right? So women have evolved over time to place a premium on resources, right? So resources because, hey, I only have limited chances to reproduce. Now, again, not everybody says, hey, I want to reproduce. We're going back to ancestral times, unconsciously, right? Only so many chances to reproduce. So women have evolved to place a premium on resources, right? And so usually those resources go into the care for the self and care for offspring and whatnot. But I believe, something has gone awry with that mechanism, and female serial killers, the ones who kill for resources, something's malfunctioned in that mechanism, and therefore they pursue resources for the sake of resources and not for investment in offspring and whatnot. So I do believe there's an evolutionary component to it. And just if I may, right, just the parallel to that is men evolved to place a premium on sex. Men produce millions of sperm on a daily basis. So what's the number one reason men kill serial male serial killers kill, it's for sex. And again, men didn't evolve for that, but it's this mechanism gone wrong. So I do strongly believe there's an evolved component to it. Again, though, as you know, evolution, something evolved doesn't make it right. It just means that these tendencies probably functioned as an adaptive survival mechanism back in the ancestral environment. And I'm surely not saying women right now need resources or whatnot, right? Everybody's independent, do what you want. I'm just saying that I do really think that there's an evolved component to this in conjunction, right, with the clinical and the proximate biological aspects, cultural, gender aspects, etc.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that last point I think is or one of the last points you made there, I think is very important to get across, because it's not that if you come up with an evolutionary explanation or any other kind of psychological explanation, you're just saying that it's okay, it's decent behavior, or it's even moral behavior. I mean, you're just trying to explain where it comes from, and you can use an evolutionary or any other kind of approach or framework in this case. But I mean, it might be that in certain cases, if you have an understanding of why people behave this or that way,
Right.
you might deal with them differently. I mean, not in the specific case of female serial killers, I guess, but in other types of crime, perhaps we might have more. I mean, instead of having prison sentences or something like that, have rehabilitation, or if we take into account some mental health issues, also more rehabilitation than prison sentences. For example, I mean, I'm just suggesting that, not saying that is the best approach or the correct approach, but I mean, just to keep in mind that explaining things is not the same thing as justifying them.
Oh, you are exactly right. Right. So some people take evolutionary psychology and I, use it as a means for whatever. Just there's some bad apples out there, right? Evolved mechanisms doesn't mean they're good. It doesn't justify them. It just is something probably worked like this in the ancestral environment. It doesn't justify behaviors now. Just because something could explain part of something doesn't mean it makes an excuse or promotes it. Absolutely. I totally agree. And I appreciate that you said that.
Great. So the book is again just as deadly, the psychology of female serial killers. I am leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Marissa, just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart from the book, where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure, absolutely. So I am associate professor of psychology at Penn State Harrisburg. Feel free to look me up on my website, shoot me an email if you have any questions. My address is on my faculty page at Penn State Harrisburg. I'd be happy to answer your questions. I'd be happy to take your feedback about the book, and I really do appreciate your interest.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you. Same here. Thank you so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzka and Blanchett Perga, Larson, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Pinha, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton Jonathan T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Antonio Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Harringman, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N. And special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.